Well, thank you for such a warm welcome. I'm very excited to be that we're partnering with AU for this event. But I guess I'll just start out with a very broad question to both of you, John and Cherisse, based off of your experience in both of your fields, in working with young legislators and looking at this data. What would you say is the leading issue that's resonating with young voters right now? John, I'll start with you.
Well, thanks for having me. I don't know for me if it's one issue. It's the fact that politics matters again to young people. I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. In the midterm elections just a few months ago, we had the highest level of participation in at least 32 years since folks have been tracking midterm elections and exit polls. It was twice the number of young people who showed up just 4 years ago. So that's kind of one thing. And what we see is the reason that people vote is when they can see a tangible difference that their votes or their engagement can make. So I think the set of issues broadly are the same set of issues that other Americans care about, but the difference is that they see the political system as being kind of a means to an end that wasn't always the case in previous election cycles.
Right. Julia, that's a tough question because there's so many issues that millennials care about. If I had to say the one leading issue where I see a lot of overlap, both with the Congressional Future Caucus through the work of MAP and also with the State Future Caucus Network, I would say it's higher education and addressing issues with crippling student debt that so many millennials have absorbed. And so at the congressional level, both Katie Hill, who you all heard from earlier today, and also Anthony Gonzalez, two of the co-chairs of the Congressional Future Caucus, they have both joined to be a bipartisan leadership on a bill that is really trying to work on expanding opportunities to higher education and also technical skills for young people that want to have those opportunities. And so that's one of the initiatives that the Congressional Future Caucus is working on. Also at the state level, most recently, the Oregon Future Caucus was a part of a coalition that was able to pass legislation, and it's really about getting opportunities for young people to have access to funds and having parents be able to invest in their child's education from a very early age and making sure that they have opportunities to use that funding to either go to a four-year institution, but also some of the technical colleges as well. And that bill was recently enacted and will be signed into law coming up next Tuesday. We're very excited about that.
Right, and Cherisse, you work with legislators across the country and young legislators, people who are thinking about running for office. Do you think those issues that you talked about are transcending state lines and really nationwide issues, or are they more maybe concentrated in one part of the country?
No, those are issues that we see crossing the country. Higher education and student debt, definitely, both at the congressional level and the state levels across the country. But young people are also worried about jobs and the economy. They're worried about the future of work. What happens whenever we no longer are staying with one employer for 20 or 30 years like our parents did, and we want to have those benefits be able to be transferable from one employer to another employer. They're caring about climate, they're caring about energy, clean energy and renewable energy. There's so many issues that young people are passionate about, and through the work that we do with the Millennial Action Project, with the Congressional Future Caucus and the State Future Caucus Network, those young people have the opportunities to voice those concerns to the young elected officials and then have those issues be introduced and be addressed through legislation.
And John, talk to me, if you will, about the trends and maybe differences you've seen really come up among young voters since you started polling. I mean, clearly there's been a number of generational shifts on a number of issues, but what have you noticed in that regard?
I think a couple of things. The first of which is we've been polling at the Institute of Politics now the youth vote for 20 years. So we've now captured the entire millennial generation, and now we're focused on the generation in which many people in this room are part of, Gen Z. And a couple things. When we started in 2000, essentially a 25-year-old and a 65-year-old were essentially as likely to vote for Bush versus Gore in 2000. There was only a 2-point difference according to the exit polls. In fact, older Americans were slightly more progressive than younger Americans in 2000. And now we've seen a massive generational shift where, in fact, it's one of the biggest divides I think we see in America today. We talk a lot about the gender divide, the education divide, the kind of race divide, but I think the most significant divide is the generation divide and the generation gap. A younger person today is voted 36 points more Democratic in the midterm election than someone who's a baby boomer or someone who's part of the silent generation. So that's a very, very significant trend, one. The other thing that we see is in through all the kind of the ideology and the typology data that we see a shift towards the left as well. But I think the other part that I wanted to kind of mention, which is unique about this generation, Gen Z, is that they have just a significant degree of fear and anxiety. And you mentioned, Cherisse, a little bit about the concern about jobs, the concern about climate and energy. And we found in our last poll that we released back in the spring is that as many young people experience fear and anxiety, more actually than joy, the previous 24 hours. So the idea of bringing voice to that and channeling those fear and frustration, anxiety towards a positive outcome, I think was one of the drivers of increasing participation in the midterm elections in an issue that is not fully recognized to the extent that I think it should and will be in future years.
And Cherisse, I think in the last midterm election in 2018, we saw so many millennials really, coming up to the bat and running for office.
Yeah.
I mean, Katie Hill was just here.
Absolutely.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, just to name a few.
Yeah.
But what's the attitude among Gen Z about running for office? I mean, they're still a little on the younger side. They're probably maybe looking into it in the future down the line, but. Are you seeing them really start to think about this, or is the Millennial Action Project really targeting them and talking to them about their futures?
Yeah, I think the generation coming behind the millennials, they're really engaged in politics as well. They're seeing what's happening. They're very well connected. They have the power of social media and the power of the internet and technology that prior generations outside of the millennial generation did not have access to. We saw a huge influx of millennials that won offices for the congressional seats in the 2018 election. That increase was more than 400%. And so not only are the young people running for office, but they're being elected and they're also paying attention. Not only are we seeing that these young people want to run, but they are also taking the time to engage with the elected officials, communicate with the elected officials, do that in a range of ways. We've seen young people sitting outside of offices. We've seen young people marching in the streets. We see young people engaging with elected officials on social media. They're holding their elected officials accountable, and they're ensuring that they are paying attention to what's going on, and hopefully they'll be running for office soon.
And I'll pose this to the both of you. You hear a lot about this, generational divide in the Democratic Party between maybe your more establishment Democrats and your progressive Democrats. But I'm actually seeing, within the Republican Party, it seems that younger Republicans, and even if you want to go deeper into those numbers, young evangelicals tend to be a lot more liberal on issues such as climate change and maybe fiscal issues than their older counterparts. Talk to me about what you both have seen in the field and in your research when it comes to the Republican Party and the generational gaps in it. And John, I'll start with you.
I actually, it's a great question. I actually did this analysis last week.
Perfect.
Perfect. So, and what we did was we compared 18 to 24-year-olds today compared to 18 to 24-year-olds in 2007. Okay, so George Bush, when he was president, and Donald Trump had essentially the same approval rating, about 30% among young people, 28 to 30%. And what I found was that the percent of people, the background of people who approve of Trump look a lot like the people who approved of Bush. Same percentage of men, about 55% men. Same percentage of whites, about 75% white, so clearly far wider than the overall generation. Same level of ideology, same percent who consider themselves to be religious, those sorts of things. Two big differences. One is the people today who support Trump are far less likely to believe that health care is a right that people should have access to and the government should provide it if it's necessary. There was almost 50%, it was in the 40s, of 10, 12 years ago of Republicans who felt that healthcare was a right, and today that's less than half of that number. So on the issue of healthcare, you would argue they're more conservative. On other issues we track, for example, same-sex, they are 14 points more progressive. So on many issues they're more progressive, but healthcare is the big difference. But overall, the young Trump voter looks a lot like the young Bush voter. The other thing that's worth noting is Democrats had a 10-point partisan advantage on self-identified party ID back in 2007, and today that's a 20-point advantage, 41 to 21. It was, I think, 35 to 25, a little half a generation ago. So those are some things that we're picking up.
Yeah, Juliet, that's a great question. There definitely are deep divides within each of the two parties, but what we're seeing is that millennials as a generation and young people in this country are disassociating themselves with either one of the two major political parties. What we've seen is that more than 70% of millennials in this country feel like we need to have a third major political party, and there's a lot that we could take from that, but I think we need to understand that millennials are not wanting to be boxed in. We don't want to just be a Democrat or just be a Republican. We're looking for candidates that really speak to the issues that we care about, candidates that we know are going to be authentic, individuals that we feel like will not only work across the aisle, but continue to work until they get the job done. And so I understand exactly what you're saying about the deep divides between the two parties, but I'll also say there are a lot of people that are disassociating between those two parties and really trying to be independents, little I.
Let's pivot to the issue or the topic of social media. It's so remarkable to me to see Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez really connecting with her constituents and talking about issues on an Instagram or Facebook Live while she's cooking dinner. And it's so funny because then you see presidential candidates like Elizabeth Warren try to mimic that. How important, hey, she's climbing in the polls, so it could have some sort of effect, but, and I'll pose this to you first, Cherisse.
Yeah.
How important is it for a leader to really connect with their constituents through social media?
I think it's incredibly important. I think, especially with the millennial generation being the largest eligible voting bloc now, the candidates are knowing that they have to connect with young people and just generations across the board through social media. It's a huge opportunity for them, and they would be remiss if they skipped over it. I think it has to be authentic. You don't want it to work against you. And so you should use the power of social media, but do it from an authentic place. We don't want you to do dances that don't feel right to you, or issues that you typically wouldn't be discussing, or things you wouldn't do. I think that's the wrong way to use social media. We really want to see the candidates connect with their constituents, connect with potential voters in an authentic manner.
Right, before I get to John, I just want to tell the audience we will have a quick Q&A session, so start thinking about the questions you want to ask, and we'll get to you. I see a lot of eager faces out there. So John, have you done any polling or research on social media and its impact on young voters in particular?
Yes, and I think the key is kind of authenticity. Younger people, I mean, we can see this in this race, and we saw this in the race a few years ago as well, which is young people look for kind of authenticity, and there's really no correlation between age of candidate, clearly, right, and who people support, being Sanders and now Elizabeth Warren doing exceptionally well with younger voters. So I think Cherisse is right in terms of as long as it's kind of part of who you are, but bigger than social media, which is now just like a vehicle, it's really important that you do make that connection. I think the important part of talking and campaigning for the millennial vote is to build that relationship earlier rather than later. It's not a transactional generation. It's not a transactional cohort like so many of the other ways in which people like us slice and dice the electorate. And that's what I learned from watching the way in which Obama, with his speech back in 2004 at that convention, kind of built that relationship over shared values. That's something I think that Sanders has clearly done. That's something that Warren is trying to do and is doing a pretty good job at it when she talks about structural reform. So the idea of really kind of tapping into this shared worldview, create a relationship, and then you can talk about policy and some of the differences.
Just on that same topic of the power of social media, I'll make a note that even seeing the elected officials engage with one another is a huge opportunity that the Millennial Action Project often tracks. After the horrific act of the Parkland shooting, we saw Representative Stephanie Murphy, who was the co-chair of the Congressional Future Caucus at that time, talk about introducing a bill to lift the ban on the CDC from studying guns. and studying gun violence. And when she posted that on Twitter, we saw our former congressional member and who was also chair of the Congressional Future Caucus, Carlos Curbelo. He said, you know what, that's something that I'm interested in and I'm gonna pledge to support it as well. And so just seeing that transaction take place shows you the value and the power of social media.
And, you know, just on that note, when we talk about the gun control debate, I mean, there are clearly both sides to this issue, but we've seen both sides of the issue kind of galvanize, and it's happened with millennials, and millennials impacted this. Millennials are Gen Z, members of Gen Z who have to go to school and are very much affected by these events. Yeah. You know, what has your polling and research shown on that front?
So we found that it was a single most significant driver of the youth vote. Frankly, in 2008, we had a list of questions in a survey that we did last summer. We had 15 or so questions, and the way in which we framed it was how important are the following things regarding the future of America. And we interviewed 15 to 29-year-olds, a few thousand of them. In school shootings, using the word school shootings, not gun control, but school shootings was the number one most important reason on a scale from 1 to 7. I think it was 52% gave it a 7. Healthcare was number 2. Economy 3, mental health was up there. So I think kind of the lesson from that is we wrote that survey after speaking to young people and understanding the ways in which they think about the issues, the words in which they use. I think is important for us as pollsters to measure that sort of reaction. The other thing I would say is that one of the highest rated pieces of policy to curb gun violence was licensing, which is something that is becoming a more significant issue in this Democratic debate. But the average 17 or 18-year-old young person I met with would say, if we need a license to drive a car, why not to own a gun? And so there's a brand new framework that I think is coming from the conversations we're having with young people, trying to incorporate that into the dialogue down up here in DC as well.
Right. Well, I'm going to open it up to the audience. Who has a question? We have some up in the front. Yep, here we go.
Hello, thank you for coming to speak to us. So traditionally, I know that, Democrats means big government, Republicans means small government, but in my experience, I think young people tend to focus more on specific issues rather than those philosophical differences. So I just wondered if you could speak to your experiences in research in regard to those differences.
I'll take a stab at this first. I think one of the things I think that defines how a young person thinks about government is the degree to which they see inequality and inequities across a variety of ways in which our society is organized around economics, around education, and other things. And that's why I think that from the Democratic side, Sanders and Warren are doing so well, because they're talking about kind of significant structural reform. One of the things that we identified, and to your point about young people don't like parties, they don't like labels, so they put a lot of, we collaborate with students. They help write the questions. They write most of the questions in our survey. So several years ago, we had a couple of students who wanted to understand what labels were most fitting. And during that time, we found out that a majority of young people rejected capitalism, and only 20 or so percent called themselves capitalists. It's not that they were socialists or social or prefer socialism. It's that they wanted to modernize the way in which our economy and our democracy was organized. So those are some of the things I think that really kind of connect with young people. And then you can talk about the specific kind of policies to move us in that direction.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and it speaks to the reason why we see young people that are disassociating from the two major political parties of the country right now. What we're seeing is that the young people want to know that these candidates and these elected officials are going to speak to the issues, whether that's a Democrat or a Republican or anybody else from another party. They don't want to just vote for you because of your party affiliation. They want to know that you have their interests at heart, their best interests at heart, and that you are going to work to address those issues. And so that's what we see time and time again with our young people that we're having these community events with. And then we give them those opportunities to share those ideas with the young elected officials and have them discuss it in a bipartisan manner. Even talking with people from the opposite party is a huge accomplishment that we try to encourage young people and all people to do, to get outside of that bubble and really talk about shifting the narrative and really how do you talk about the issues in a constructive and collaborative way. We have to get away from this divisive partisan politics and really find opportunities for people and young people specifically, because we are the future of this country, to come together and work through some of these issues.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, I'm just curious if you felt that in this cycle, messaging will play an outsized role in affecting the outcomes of polling, given that, for instance, if you ask the same group of people how they felt about the Affordable Care Act and how they felt about Obamacare, you're likely to get some very different answers. I'm just curious if that you anticipate that playing at a high level of role, a major role in this election.
In terms of polling, it could. You know, we spend a lot of time trying to kind of develop questions to give a sense of like the reasons behind, you know, the policies that people support or oppose, which is why I talked about the sense of fear, right? I talked about the sense of problems around structural reform, those sorts of things. Yeah, so you have to be a very, very smart consumer of polling these days to really kind of understand that. And the good news is there's a lot of polling, and it's as transparent as it's ever been. And I think, generally speaking, the state of the industry is strong and getting stronger because of a lot of the innovations that are happening. But yes, especially on some of these issues-based polling, I think you do need to be very careful of word choice. Obamacare versus Affordable Care Act. And also appreciate and understand that you might be thinking about that as a young person in American University, caring about politics. But we need to, as pollsters, make sure that we can talk to all Americans, or those which people may not have strong views about the Affordable Care Act right now. They may not have thought about the way in which we think about that, and asking questions that are relevant to people and respecting that politics is one small but important part of their lives. It's important. Well,
I think that's all the time we have for tonight, but thank you so much, John and Cherisse. This has been fantastic. Thank you all, everyone.